You're listening to America's Web Radio on the AmericasBroadcastNetwork.com. Thank you for listening.
Oh, this is Professor Robert D'Agostino with Do Facts Matter, and today I'm going to talk about systemic racism, and in a way that I don't think you've ever heard before, but I'm going to do it. Before I do that, I just made a comment on this election. I've been talking to a lot of people, and it's amazing. The polls show that, of course, it could be a landslide in favor of Biden and Harris, and that the Republicans will definitely lose the Senate. On the other hand, when you talk to people in these various states, or even they all seem to say to me, and now I agree that these are Trump supporters, that they believe Trump's going to win. And these are the same people I talked to in 2016, or a lot of them are, and they're the same people who said Trump's going to win. In Pennsylvania was the interesting state in 2016 because I told my class in 2016 that I had a hunch Trump was going to win, and that Pennsylvania, the polls are wrong. And one way I thought the polls were wrong is I had some friends in Pennsylvania, including some Democrats, who told me that things were going in Trump's direction in Pennsylvania. And one Democratic operative said that if Hillary Clinton doesn't get here soon, it's going to go for Trump. I also had a very good friend who's actually a very good friend of my wife's, and he's a friend of mine. And he's a professor. He's now retired, a very prominent professor, and he tends to be kind of a moderate, right-of-center Republican, often voting for Democrats. And he told me that he didn't believe the polls, that he thought Trump would take Ohio easily, and that's exactly what happened in 2016. So I don't want to be optimistic, but I can't, having lived in Delaware while Joe Biden was a senator, I cannot imagine him as president. He used to be called the senator from Wilmington Trust. And I quoted a few things last week about him from an article that from one of his supporters. I mean, he's always been a corrupt, serial liar, not very bright. And the last lie he told, most recent one that I could see of, was the one where he said the Boilers Makers Union in Pennsylvania endorsed him when in fact they endorsed Trump. And of course the media doesn't call him on any of it, let alone the corruption. Everyone's known that there's a level of corruption in the Biden family in Delaware. I don't think anybody realized there was this much. But let me get back to what I'm going to talk about today, because I think, I'm drafting an article, well footnoted. So everything I say, I'm going to have a footnote for, and a reference to where anyone who reads it can look it up and check on my veracity. They may not believe in my conclusions, but the article is called "Systemic Racism and the Democrat Party." That's right. The Democratic Party has been the vehicle for systemic racism since really they've been formed. And of course, the modern Democratic Party was created under Jackson. But let's forget that area. Let's go to the end of the Civil War. Now, I refer to the end of the shooting as the end of the war between the states, and here's why. I think the Civil War really started before the war between the states. I think it started in 1850 with the signing of the Fugitive Slave Act, the Fugitives. I teach sales and secure transactions, so I got that on my mind today because it's near the end of the semester. But the Fugitive Slave Act was, of course, sponsored by Stephen Douglas, Senator Stephen Douglas, yes, a Democrat, the same Douglas who debated Abraham Lincoln and who ran for president against Lincoln. And he, of course, wanted to compromise. So the Fugitive Slave Act allowed remove the protection of slaves who got to a free state and they were free. Now the slavers could chase them into the free states and return them as property, runaway property to Southern slaveholders. And that really set off the Civil War, because that set off actual fights and shooting between abolitionists or anti-slavery people and the slave hunters and neighbors in Kansas and Nebraska and what have you, and shooting between neighbors who opposed slavery and those who were anti-slavery. And so I always say that's when it started. The Civil War started then, and it mushroomed into the course of war between the states. And I don't really believe the Civil War ended until the Civil Rights Acts of the 60s, which I'll address briefly in a minute. So the Civil War really encompassed something like 100 years or more, over 100 years. And where's the Democrat Party been in terms of their relationship to American blacks? And by the way, I read a poll about do blacks prefer to be called black or African American, and it's pretty evenly split. So it's American blacks, African American if you'd like. And let's I cite my article by saying the Democrat Party has, from the end of the war between the states through today's progressive takeover, has abused and used the African American community with the goal of achieving and maintaining power, regardless of the harm visited upon that community. That's the theme of this article. Listen carefully. The left, the progressive left, the Democrat Party, doesn't give a hoot about black citizens. They only care about how they can use the black community to maintain power or get power. And let's take a look at a little history of that. And definition of racism, of course, is treating people based on their color differently than you would treat people of your own color. And let's take a look at this. After the Civil War, the war between the states, after the shooting war, the Ku Klux Klan formed in the South. Ulysses S. Grant was then president when that happened, and he sent troops down to crush the Ku Klux Klan to protect black American citizens. During Ulysses S. Grant's second term, something similar occurred. There was some movement by white terrorist groups in the South to deny blacks their voting rights, deny blacks their rights to due process of law and what have you. Ulysses S. Grant once again proposed the sending of troops. He failed to send those troops to protect American citizens in the South. Why? Because under the second term of Ulysses S. Grant, the Democrat Party controlled the House of Representatives, and they refused to fund his request to send troops to protect American citizens. Absolutely refused. And why was this hostility, such great hostility towards black American citizens? Because they voted Republican. You had to, talking about voter suppression, this was the classic voter suppression, and it was done by the Democrats. They wanted to make sure those blacks could not vote because they would vote Republican. In came the Jim Crow laws, in came the outrageous chain gangs and all sorts of ways that, in a sense, partially re-enslaved the black community. Now we can skip over the racist attitudes of Woodrow Wilson and he known racist. In fact, after Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft integrated the federal bureaucracy, Woodrow Wilson had every black that was in any sort of a position of authority fired when he became president. And of course, last week I talked about the Samuel Gompers, the labor leader, and part of his appeal was, white work for white men. In other words, no skilled labor jobs for blacks, even though they were very much in demand in Washington, D.C., and as carpenters elsewhere. But anyway, let's skip that for a minute and go to the fact in the 30s. In the 1930s, we, of course, had the Great Depression, which, by the way, if you look at Amity Shale's book, she has a very good economist. She has a very good argument for how Franklin Roosevelt kept us in depression for 6 extra years by his government policies. But putting that aside, we had a depression, so poverty drove many out of the South, particularly blacks, came north to the big cities in order to find work, in order to take care of their families. They were greeted in these big cities by, a lot of them, Chicago, New York, for example, Boston, by very strong Democrat machines, political machines. Now, these political machines had a lot of experience at welcoming immigrants from overseas. They would welcome the immigrants, my father included, in fact, in New York. They would welcome the immigrants. They would come off the bus, the ships, and they would offer them help in finding jobs. They would offer them assistance in finding a place to live, and the exchange was political loyalty. I mean, my father voted straight Democrat in New York until 1952. In 1952, he voted for Eisenhower for president, and then switched all down-ballot elections for the Democrats. Now, obviously, in those days in New York, the Democrats were socially conservative, and none of this same-sex marriage stuff, and none of this abortion, what have you. So the Democratic Party was a labor, social democrat, socially conservative Democrat Labor Party. And so these machines, these political machines during the 30s, seeing all these blacks coming and knowing the blacks had the right to vote, and they were very concerned about them voting Republican. So they actually went out and started to court the black voters to see if they could switch some to the Democratic Party, which they succeeded in doing. The black votes for Republicans went down substantially, and for Democrats it started to increase all through the 30s. And not that the Democrats treated the American blacks all that well, because they didn't. Let me just give you a extraneous fact that most people don't know. Redlining. Where did redlining start? In the Franklin Roosevelt administration. He started redlining so that banks would not loan money into inner city communities that had turned largely minority black, so loans to improve their homes, loans to buy new homes. But if you went to the suburbs, that's a different story. Off you went to the suburbs, and you could get a guaranteed government loan, especially if you were a veteran. So redlining started by the Democrats in the Franklin Roosevelt administration and was aimed at preventing money going into the minority neighborhoods. We're up against a break. I'll be right back to continue my discussion of systemic racism and the Democrat Party.
If you live to serve and want to make an even bigger difference, consider joining the U.S. Army. With training in fields like medical care, linguistics, and engineering, an Army career can amplify your efforts with humanitarian opportunities all over the world. Plus, you'll receive competitive pay and incredible benefits, so you'll be taken care of, too. Learn more at GoArmy.com.
Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls of all ages, I am Roger B., host of the Locked and Loaded Show on America's Web Radio. Join me live every Tuesday at 1500 for the best in gun news, gun products, and gun politics.
Hey folks, this is Victor Armendariz with the On Point with Victor show. Just to remind you, don't miss every Tuesday 2 to 3 live right here on America's Web Radio. And remember, I'm not angry, I'm just right.
You're listening to America's Web Radio on the AmericasBroadcastNetwork.com. Thank you for listening.
Robert, before we come back, I just want to mention the fact that everybody has to go out and vote, and we just can't elect a sick individual like Biden is. Every doctor that is on the station and does shows on the stations has mentioned over and over again that Biden is in last stages even. And I think it's an embarrassment for the Democratic Party to even be running Biden. They're making a fool out of him, and he's making a fool out of himself when he didn't know the name of the president or who he was running against, and his wife had to keep telling him Trump, Trump, Trump. And, he's not gotten any better, and I just personally cringe at the thought of Biden sitting down with somebody like Putin or the North Korean president or whatever. It would just be a sham. So, America's Web Radio, since the get-go, has endorsed President Trump and encourage everybody to get out and vote. And we always hear about, well, this is the most important election. I think, personally, it's do or die, and that figuratively and literally. It's going to be bad, so please make it a landslide for our president that's done, these Democrats that you get in an argument with or you try to talk to, I'm still trying to figure out what Trump has done so bad. In fact, I think we have the best economy going. He got caught up in something that he didn't know was coming, the COVID-19. He reacted to that and was criticized for his reactions, but he did what was right. And we totally, 100% at America's Web Radio endorse Donald J. Trump and invite and plead with you to go out and vote for him.
Well, I certainly, this is Professor D'Agostino back again with Two Facts Matter. I certainly agree with the sentiments expressed by the producer here, David Moxley. Certainly it's my feelings, too, that this we could lose a lot. And especially, look at what's going on. Biden and Harris are really not campaigning. They are. I mean, it's not only Biden who's in his bunker. Kamala Harris has been used very sparingly. They don't want the American people to experience either one of them. And they can believe they can win this by hiding their candidates. And of course, Biden, I read that last week from the Harper's Magazine, that comment about, they know Biden is essentially is dishonest. They know he is a limited intelligence. All that stuff is they all know. But the key was, as they put it in the article, as the author put it in the article, Biden can be pushed, means Biden can be manipulated, and that's what they're counting on. And if the American people don't understand what we're facing a group of people who consider themselves the elite, who are global citizens. They are not U.S. citizens psychologically. In fact, somebody just about a year ago, was asked if they were going to fly the American flag on Veterans Day. This was, maybe 2 years ago, and she said, "Well, of course not. I'm not a Republican." So I think we got the answer. This is the global elites, and they're on the East Coast and the West Coast. Why is Wall Street completely behind Biden? Why are the hedge fund managers behind Biden? Why is the tech people behind Biden? Because they don't give a hoot about Americans. They have nothing but contempt for ordinary Americans. They have nothing but contempt for Christianity, and what they're interested in is two things: libertarian sex, not libertarian economics, but totally sexual license, and access to the Chinese market. I mean, Xi, the current head of the Communist Party in China, who's tightening his grip on China, has made it very plain. He feels the United States has had it, that this country's in decline, and the future belongs to China. And that is exactly how some of our elites feel. The future belongs to China. And anyway, we got 1.3 billion Chinese to buy our goods, to buy our services, and to make us even richer than we are. Jeff Bezos is not rich enough at $200 billion in Amazon, right? And Gates is not rich enough with 90 billion, 86 or 90 billion dollars in his personal accounts. They look at China and say, we need to be there. So the support for a centralized command economy by the elites is remarkable. I mean, that's what corporate capitalism, socialism is in various degrees, is a command economy, command from the center. The center will decide. And if that's what the American people want, that's what they're going to get. And I mentioned, I think last week, the article in the recent Commentary magazine called "You Will Be Re-Educated." It's a scary article, and it has to do with the cancel culture. If you say, as your professor, and you say, oh, well, all lives matter, you can be fired because that's a racist statement. You have to say Black Lives Matter. Never mind that the organization Black Lives Matter doesn't care a hoot about Black lives. They could care less about Black lives. They're a revolutionary group, and they'll worry about it. It reflects what a socialist said some years ago, and I forgot who the socialist was who said this, but when he was confronted with the enormity of the crimes being perpetrated in the Soviet Union and exposed by the speech of Nikita Khrushchev and the gulags and the people killed, his cool response, this is from a socialist response, we always thought we had to sacrifice a generation. Look it up. I forgot his name, but if you put that phrase in, you'll find out who said it. We always thought we had to sacrifice a generation. For what? Utopia. And you never have utopia. So the left ultimately and progressives ultimately about one thing, destruction, I should say two things, destruction and exercise of power. But they always have to destroy what's there because it never becomes a utopian system that they have planned. And Hitler was as much utopian as current progressives. He had a different definition of what utopia was, that's all. But command from the center, and command from the center always means first economic command and then social and cultural command. But getting back to my theme, systemic racism and the Democrat Party, and the Democrat Party is the vehicle for systemic racism, and it always has been the vehicle for systemic racism. And so where are we? We're up now to the, let's go to the post-World War II era. We'll skip over Woodrow Wilson and the beginning of the progressive movement, skip over eugenics, which was a progressive, one of the great progressive causes was eugenics, and eugenics meant to the elimination of inferior peoples and races. I mean, after all, Planned Parenthood was partially founded in order to encourage blacks to have abortions, so we decrease the number of that population. And they haven't changed. That's what Ruth Bader Ginsburg said. Abortion is a good idea because it reduces the number of people in populations we don't want more of. That's what she said. And go ahead and look it up. New York Times interview, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, abortion. Look it up. It's on the internet. Don't listen to me. Just look it up. Well, let's go to the 50s because things. After World War II, the black family was quite stable. Only 11% of black babies were born out of wedlock, 3% of whites, 11% of blacks. Today it's like 72% of blacks, 30% of whites. Disasters befallen both races in the lower income groups to a large extent. But the family was stable. Crime was low in black neighborhoods. Unemployment, in fact, in some of the years, unemployment among blacks was lower than unemployment among whites. The income gap between whites and black was narrowing, slowly, but it was narrowing. Look it up. It was narrowing. And I'm going to footnote everything with my article. In 1957, Eisenhower signed the Civil Rights Act of 1957. Eisenhower, a Republican, sent troops to Little Rock to enforce integration orders in the high schools there. So once again, the Democrat Party was faced with the possibility that blacks, if too many of them moved into the middle class and they became not so dependent, they might vote Republican. We can't have that. We can't have that. So in came all these schemes, not the Civil Rights Acts. The Civil Rights Acts were the icing on the cake. And by the way, as most people know, the Civil Rights Acts had, almost all of them had overwhelmingly Republican support in the Senate and House. And the Democrats were, to a large extent, controlled by the segregationists of the South, so they resisted these Civil Rights Acts. And you say, oh, well, what about Barry Goldwater? Well, that's true. Barry Goldwater did resist some of the Civil Rights Acts on constitutional grounds, not on racist grounds, on constitutional grounds. And let me point out to you that Barry Goldwater was a founder in Arizona of a branch of the NAACP. So he was known in Arizona for his inclusive racial attitudes. But anyway, he did oppose, and so between the Civil Rights Act being signed by a Democrat President, Johnson, and some of the leadership, Hubert Humphrey, the late, great Hubert Humphrey, being one of the keys behind pushing the Civil Rights Act, so the blacks were saying, well, maybe it's the Democrats that are with us. And of course, the great lobbyist for the Civil Rights Act was Clarence Mitchell. And there was a book written about him by a fellow named Denton called Lion in the Lobby. And he tirelessly lobbied for the passage of the Civil Rights Acts in Congress. And in the book, Lion in the Lobby, the author of the book then quotes Clarence Mitchell as saying, how did he lobby? He said, well, when I went to Democrats, particularly in the North, I pointed out how many votes they could get by supporting this. I appealed to them on their self-interest about votes. I mean, a lot of them represented districts from urban areas, and they could get more votes and be sure of elected. But when I went to Republicans, I had to do it on moral grounds, what's right and what's wrong. I mean, a lot of these Republicans were in lily-white areas. They had no particular upside by voting for supporting the Civil Rights Act. But for them, I had to make it on a moral argument. I urge you to buy the book. It's a good book, Clarence Mitchell, Lion in the Lobby. So the Democrats were thinking about votes. The Republicans were thinking about what's right and what's wrong. That wasn't enough. The problem has to do with how do we keep the black community dependent on the government, central government. Under Roosevelt, and we've gotten a lot of new black votes, but there's some drifting back towards the Republicans here in the 50s. We can't let that happen. Enter the Great Society and the war on poverty. Yes, there are some people who supported that, especially some knuckleheaded academics who thought this was a wonderful idea. But as George Orwell said, that there are some ideas that are so absurd, only an intellectual could believe them. So intellectuals pushed this war on poverty, or as someone said, we were winning the war on poverty until we decided to fight it. But what were the results of the war on poverty? The results on war on poverty was to make lower income groups, and this was particularly black groups, dependent on the government for subsidies, aid for dependent children. What could be more evil than in result than aid for dependent children? Aid for dependent children meant that the fathers of these children no longer had to support them. There was no longer pressure in the community for fathers to support them. And I don't take my word for all this. Don't take my word for the destruction wrought by the Great Society. Let's take the word of Daniel Patrick Moynihan, and I'll be right back to talk about him.
Hi, I'm Dr. Mike Karuchak. Join me and my co-host, Dr. Hal Schertz, every Thursday morning at 8 a.m. and listen to the Doctor's Lounge, where you get a private insight into the conversations that doctors have amongst themselves. Join us Thursday, 8 a.m. every week.
This is Jim Davis with Operation Santa. Each year, we purchase Christmas gifts for all of the children of all Georgia's servicemen and women who are deployed overseas during the holidays. Our annual fundraising event, the Freedom Fighters Open Golf Tournament, is being held on Friday, November 6th at the Bridge Mill Golf Club in Canton, Georgia. I would like to personally invite you to join us in raising money to support Georgia's troops and their families. For more information and to register a team, go to operationsanta.org.
Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls of all ages, I am Roger B., host of the Locked and Loaded Show on America's Web Radio. Join me live every Tuesday at 1500 for the best in gun news, gun products, and gun politics.
You're listening to America's Web Radio on the AmericasBroadcastNetwork.com. Thank you for listening.
Agostino back with Do Facts Matter? And obviously facts don't matter to the left. Daniel Patrick Moynihan, there are many, many studies that were being done by sociologists about the effect on communities, low-income communities, of the war on poverty, obviously initially concentrating on American black communities, but spread beyond that. In fact, the matter is, some of the results, unintended results of the war on poverty was, of course, increase in illegitimacy, increase in crime, increase in all sorts of pathologies, social pathologies. England, Great Britain, actually copied some of the Great Society programs about 10 years later, and applied them to largely white communities, lower-income white communities, and with the same results: rising crime, rising illegitimacy, divorces, all sorts of pathologies, lower achievements in school, what have you. Same results, same misguided programs, misguided policies, same results, and regardless of race. In England, it was aimed at lower-income whites mostly, and initially, and in this country, of course, it was aimed initially at lower-income groups in the inner cities, which were blacks. So, looking at what happened, the results of the war on poverty, the results of the Great Society on society itself, on cultural norms, on behavior, were terrible. And Daniel Patrick Moynihan said that. And he said it in a famous article that was published in Public Interest magazine. Public Interest magazine was a magazine published by Nathan Glazer as the editor out of Harvard. And Daniel Patrick Moynihan was a very famous sociologist at Harvard, as was Nathan Glazer. Daniel Patrick Moynihan was so well respected that he became an advisor to Kennedy, an advisor to Johnson, an advisor to Nixon. So he was there at the beginning. He was there and certainly had his input into these programs. And his motives, there are people, including Lyndon Johnson, who knew this war on poverty was a bad idea because it would increase dependency, which is a bad idea. But of course, liberals, as opposed to progressives, liberals are bleeding hearts. They always want to do something. They shed a tear, and so they want to do something for somebody to make them feel good. They don't care about that. They don't really consider I didn't say care, but they don't really consider the harm it does to the so-called beneficiaries of these programs. But it does make them feel good. And but they don't have evil motives, maybe narcissistic motives, make them feel good, virtue signaling and all that stuff. But Daniel Patrick Moynihan said, what a terrible, terrible thing. However, it did have the desired effect of increasing dependency in the lower income communities, particularly black communities, reinforced their voting for the Democrats, and combined with the Democrats going around saying the Republicans are your enemies. See, Barry Goldwater voted against the Civil Rights Act. They're your enemies. They want to re-enslave you, and all sorts of demagogic nonsense. Unfortunately, between Barry Goldwater's opposing the Civil Rights Act on constitutional grounds, it's hard to explain that to people, the intricacies of constitutional theory, and the free money. We're going to give you all this money. And certainly initially, I'm sure it gave a real boost to various families, But what it eventually led to was families breaking up because they could get. In fact, in the beginning, a lot of the programs, you can only benefit from these programs if there weren't a husband, if there weren't someone in the family making the money, a breadwinner in the family, man, generally speaking. Only if you didn't have a breadwinner, you didn't have a husband, could you qualify for some of these benefits. So essentially, the federal government was subsidizing illegitimacy and indirectly crime, because there's certainly a connection between males raised in single-parent homes, women homes, and crime. And it's not woke to say it. You're not allowed to say it anymore, but it's all in the literature. There's lots of tests for that. Who gets in trouble? Who's likely not to do well in school? And that's all. And there's a huge difference between those raised in two-parent homes and those raised in single-family homes, single-parent homes. And so anyway, this dependency was encouraged, and one of the great comments about it was, of course, by Malcolm X. Now, Malcolm X had nothing but contempt for the white liberals. Look it up. And because they knew what's best for everybody. They knew what's best for these poor little black folks who couldn't take care of themselves without our help and our assistance, without our programs, without our virtuous attempt to create equity in the black communities. Now let me tell you two stories about that. When I was in the Justice Department, there was a high school in Milwaukee, as I recall, that was virtually all black. And it was a marvelous high school. It was the pride of the community. The students were graduating from there and going on to college in numbers that were equal to numbers of white students going to college, or maybe exceeding them. I don't remember the exact figures. Achievement levels were high. But in comes the white liberals, in comes the ACLU. Oh no, we can't have segregated schools. This school is 90% black or 95% black. We got to bus you to the white schools in the suburbs. We don't want to be bused to the white schools. We got a wonderful school right here, and our graduates are going to college. They're achieving in college. They achieve here. They achieve in college. They're achieving in life. Why would we want to bus them out of here? Why would we want them to ride 30, 40 minutes on a bus because they rub shoulders with white kids? I mean, what? Better schools? No, our school is terrific. They sued in order to force busing, and of course the liberal judges did it and wrecked the school, even though the local NAACP opposed the busing order. The Justice Department was sided with the local local parents in Milwaukee, but the school was destroyed by the, quote, well-meaning, unquote, liberals for purposes, ideological purposes. Never mind the result. It's like Gary Orfield, who did a lot of studies on busing. And I remember reading his study, and the headline of his study was, after forced busing, after integration, the gap in achievement between whites and blacks narrowed. That's the headline, and that's true. Now, when you read the whole report, it turns out that black achievement declined, but white achievement declined more. So yes, the gap narrowed. Both groups were penalized by and sacrificed at the altar of ideology, which we're seeing that today. So we had, and I'll go into that in a minute. So we had Malcolm X talking about white liberals and their encouragement of dependency and treating blacks, and that's the essence of racism, treating blacks like they didn't have agency, that they couldn't make decisions for themselves. And as if to confirm that, or a recent confirmation of that attitude, was a show that they put nice white parents which was I think a 5-part show on public TV, Nice White Parents. And it talks about education and what have you. This is a review of that show that appeared in commentary in the same issue where the headline of commentary, the October 2020 issue, the cover of commentary says, "You will be re-educated" by Christine Rosen. I urge you to. It's about the cancel culture. And what it said there. And it talks about, it goes about talking about a few things which I'm not going to do, but I want to read this. Nice White Parents does exactly this, but even more insidious, it leaves the impression that hold on, excuse me for a moment. I've got something in my eye here. Okay, Nice White Parents does exactly this, but even more insidiously, it leaves the impression that parents of color lack agency, that any hope of getting a good education depends entirely on the permission and largesse of white people. Joffe Walt, who is the who scripted this show, states this unambiguously. This is a quote. "I don't see how it's possible to have equal public schools, common schools that serve every child, unless we limit the power of white parents." Because it never struck her that maybe you can enhance the power of black parents. Maybe you let black parents choose. Maybe you support school choice. I mean, one of the first things Obama did when he became president was destroy the school choice system in Washington, D.C. There are schools, Success, for instance, the Success schools, Success Institute schools, where the achievement of the black students in high school and middle school is equal to or exceeds the achievement of white students, even in upper middle class and upper class neighborhoods, public schools. I don't understand why the Democrats, and the progressives particularly, don't trust the blacks to run their own affairs. And they don't. Who's in favor of defunding the police? Not the people who live in crime-ridden black neighborhoods. Who's in favor of stopping the pimps and the drug dealers from plying their trade? Not the people who live, not the law-abiding people, the vast majority of them who live in these crime-infested black neighborhoods, but the white politicians are. I'll be back after the break.
And we want to thank you for listening to America's Web Radio and remind you that Colonel Rick White, who is the director of the Georgia Military Veterans Hall of Fame, asked me to please pass on this announcement. Is the November 7th, introductory induction ceremony. I said introductory, I should have said induction ceremony. That's held generally in Columbus, Georgia, will be postponed because of the COVID-19 and the laws about too many people meeting under the same roof, unless it's a protest. And it's not a protest. This is a induction ceremony.
I think you mean riot.
Pardon?
I think you mean riot, not protest.
Oh, a riot? If it was a riot, it'd be okay, but
yes, of course.
Okay. But not a induction of heroes from Georgia that have served in our military over the years. So we will be announcing as soon as we have a date and time when the induction ceremony will be, but don't want people to get carried away, try to buy tickets, or show up in Columbus on the 7th of November, and there is no induction ceremony. So we'll be back in just a moment with Robert D'Agostino and Do Facts Matter right after this.
Hey folks, this is Victor Armendariz with the On Point with Victor show. You ever find yourself wondering if you're getting the truth or can you find the truth? Well, don't fear. Tune in every Tuesday, 2 to 3, right here on America's Web Radio, the On Point with Victor show, where I won't sugarcoat a thing. I'm going to tell you how it is.
If you live to serve and want to make an even bigger difference, consider joining the U.S. Army. With training in fields like medical care, linguistics, and engineering, an Army career can amplify your efforts with humanitarian opportunities all over the world. Plus, you'll receive competitive pay and incredible benefits, so you'll be taken care of, too. Learn more at GoArmy.com.
This is Jim Davis with Operation Santa. Each year, we purchase Christmas gifts for all of the children of all Georgia servicemen and women who are deployed overseas during the holidays. Our annual fundraising event, the Freedom Fighters Open Golf Tournament, is being held on Friday, November 6th at the Bridge Mill Golf Club in Canton, Georgia. I would like to personally invite you to join us in raising money to support Georgia's troops and their families. For more information and to register a team, go to OperationSanta.org.
You're listening to America's Web Radio on the AmericasBroadcastNetwork.com. Thank you for listening.
This is Professor Robert D'Agostino back with Do Facts Matter. Well, I had mentioned Success. The Success Academy. I think I said Success Institute. The Success Academy has had so much success with minority students that there are places where they're opening up, and white parents, even in upper class areas, want to put their children at a Success Academy. And one of the things they do in Success Academy is they require parents to be involved in their child's education, which is very important, and studies show that. They also are strict about discipline, and there's none of this chaos. It's wonderful when the liberals say, well, when you talk about chaos and disruption in the school, that's a code for racism. That's what that is. No, it's not a code for anything. It's a code for chaos and disruption. And insofar as you can control that, you can actually perhaps educate the students, actually educate them, actually teach them something. And so that's why so many black parents have shifted support to school choice. Look, Ron DeSantis in Florida won the governorship, and there was a number of polls that indicated that he would not win, but he did. He won narrowly, and one reason he won narrowly is the number of black parents deserted the Democrat Party and voted for him for governor on the basis that he was for school choice, and the Democrat, although he was black, was against school choice. And so that gave DeSantis the margin of victory. Well, getting back to where we are in this systemic race. Well, I mean, that's another example of systemic racism. Essentially, they don't want black parents to be able to choose what schools they can choose. I mean, they're not capable, obviously, according to the progressives, of making those kind of judgments for their own family. And I think what's happening now is interesting. The question is just how much of a black vote will Trump get? There's a lot of blacks, African Americans, who are particularly males, who are reconsidering their allegiance to the Democrat Party. And let me just go back. This points a danger for the Democrats, which they fully realize and not tell you what they're doing about it. When my father voted for Eisenhower, that's the first Republican he ever voted for president. Under Eisenhower, he voted straight Democrat. When a group allied with a particular party, like Italian Americans in New York City and Boston were at that time, when a particular group is allied with a party, and when they shift, they first shift at the top. The shift always starts at the top. So if in this coming election, 15%, 20%, 25% of blacks vote for Trump, and then they shift and mostly vote for Democrats below that, that would be really like a Titanic hitting the iceberg for the Democrats. It means that something's really going on that could cause them the allegiance of a voting group, and then the voting group will become more varied. Republicans get 30, 40%, 50%, sometimes 30%, but it wouldn't be a monolithic voting group any longer. And of course, the Democrats are very worried about that, and that, no question, is why they're some of the viciousness of the attacks on Trump and the charges of racism and the charges of mistreatment by the police, which is supported by law and order by Trump. Look, there was a poll taken by people who live in these areas impacted by lower policing, and they want more policing, as much or more policing, not less. Look what happened in New York. Black Lives Matter, Antifa, the progressives, they don't care about black lives. If they did, they would want more stop and frisk. Yes, stop and frisk is humiliating for some blacks. It's humiliating for anybody to be stopped and frisked, and especially if they feel there's absolutely no reason for it. And of course, under Bloomberg, it became a little excessive in New York. But look what happened to the homicide rate, from 2,000 a year to 200 a year. And it's going sky high now. Homicide rates are going, as the police no longer are doing policing, because how can they? They're not backed by the politicians, the so-called leadership in the cities. They're no longer feared by the community, by the criminals in the community, the pimps, the drug dealers, the burglars. They no longer fear them because they feel that the police can't do a thing, because if police try to arrest them, police try to do anything, they can yell racism, they can fight them, they can oppose them. And this is what's happening in the country. When you lose respect for any constituted authority, then anything goes. And contrary to belief among the progressives, man is not perfectible. We're not going to ever be able to create heaven on earth. The utopia is not going to happen. No matter how you define it, there won't be a utopia on this earth. Man by nature has an evil side if it's not controlled. And I always like the Catholic view is, and it's also the Christian and Jewish view. Hate the sin, love the sinner. And what controls the aggressive tendencies, particularly of young men? Let's face it. Yes, young men. Young men, brains of men don't mature until they're 23, 24. Women mature a couple of years sooner. But just go to college and see the difference in behavior of men and women. So how do we control it? Well, three things. Family. Well, the left has destroyed the family. In this country, not only through their tolerance of all sorts of deviant marriages, deviant based on how marriages used to be considered, deviation from the norm. And that's the least of it, because there's a lot of positives you can also argue for same-sex marriage. But the family, destroyed by and large, in low-income communities particularly. The church no longer has influence, and the attack is under unrelenting attack by the left, the progressive left. Christians are considered evil. If you say the definition of tolerance has now been changed, and it means intolerance. So intolerance now means you're tolerant, right? Intolerant of views that don't agree with yours, Christian views, traditional views, moral views. That makes you intolerant, and those who are accusing you of intolerance, they're tolerant, but they won't tolerate your views. Tolerance means that you disagree, that you disapprove, but you accept people as they are. It's basically what it means. So now what? The family, the church, and now constituted authority. Those are the three breaks. Those are the three breaks on uncivil and violent and even criminal behavior. The family, the church, constituted authority. You attack all three, or you decrease the importance of all three, and you get what we get in some of the inner cities now, the murder rates, Baltimore, St. Louis, Chicago, and even now in Atlanta, the homicide rate is going sky high. Overall crime is not going sky high, but a lot that may have to do with burglaries and those sort of things are down. But violent crime, most people are concerned with violent crime. That's what really concerns people. And that's going sky high all over the country as police refrain from policing. And as many police retire, quit, and there's shortages of police. And as people like Kim Foxx in Chicago let criminals go. The Democrat Party's for no bail. No bail money. Just go out on bail. And all this is for ideological reasons. I mean, this idea of no stop and frisk is illogical. It indicates that they don't care really about black lives. I mean, look, most males outgrow their criminal behavior by the time they're in their mid to late 20s, early 30s. They've outgrown their criminal behavior. So the fact that they might have to suffer, some might have to suffer from a little humiliation once in a while to save their lives, would seem to be a good trade-off. But so now what are the Democrats going to do about the fact that they may be losing some black votes? Well, right now, this election, they seem to be making this up by white suburban women who have, I think, probably lost the ability, a lot of them, to think logically, voting for a party that's for nationalizing zoning. No longer will zoning be a local issue. It'll be nationalized through Washington. President Obama promulgated a regulation just to do that, and they tried it out in Westchester, New York. And now Biden has embraced this regulation, and zoning will be done from the center. We're going to create the utopian society where everything is the same. There'll be a quota for wealthy folks, a quota for poor folks, a quota for people living in high-rises, a quota for people living in single-family homes. And in fact, one of the goals of the left is to eliminate single-family homes. And so you out there, you suburban moms, think about it. Think about the future, and think about the suburban future. Think of why you move to certain areas. And by the way, the suburbs are very integrated on the average, much more than the inner cities, although there's a lot of white folks moving back into the inner cities now. That's the end of the show. Thank you for listening, and I'll be back next week.
If you live to serve and want to make an even bigger difference, consider joining the U.S. Army. With training in fields like medical care, linguistics, and engineering, an Army career can amplify your efforts with humanitarian opportunities all over the world. Plus, you'll receive competitive pay and incredible benefits, so you'll be taken care of, too. Learn more at GoArmy.com.
You're listening to America's Web Radio on the America's Broadcast Network.